Hi everyone, I'm Linda from Colorworks Designs and welcome into my Coloricious Sewing Studio. Today I want to show you 3 different methods of setting up your appliques to emulate needle turn hand applique, but you're actually doing the stitching by machine. The first method is just your normal raw edge fusible web method. That's the method that we're all used to, where you use a product of an iron-on adhesive fusible web like Heat and Bond Light. You're tracing your shape on the smooth side of that paper. You're then rough cutting the shape out and then ironing that shape to the wrong side of the fabric you wish it to be. And then you cut the shape out on the line and fuse it to your background fabric. So using that raw edge fusible web, I've set up this teacup and saucer shape that you see here. But the difference is, instead of zigzagging or blanket stitching or buttonhole stitching around these shapes with a colored thread, what I've done is set my machine to a very, very tiny blind hem stitch, or a tiny zigzag stitch. And in the top, I've put this clear thread. And I happen to like the Superior Thread monopoly version of clear thread versus a nylon clear thread. And what I mean by that is Superior Threads makes their clear thread out of polyester versus other brands that do it out of nylon. So if you have to iron your applique when you're done, you don't have to worry about the clear thread melting away because it's made out of polyester versus nylon. And you can see here in this example that you can barely see the stitching. There are some tiny little puncture holes maybe on the edges here that are visible if you go very close up to this. But for the most part, this does a pretty good job of emulating needle turn hand applique, but actually stitching it by machine. The second method I want to show you is using an interfacing. I prefer the Shape Flex interfacing by Pellon. It goes by the number SF101. It's used for cuffs, collars when you're doing dressmaking, or perhaps you add it to the back of a pillow to add more body to the pillow, stiffen it up a bit. It's a one-sided woven fusible interfacing. Now this method I'm showing you works really well for very simple shapes like the center of a Dresden flower or a circle or a square or things like that. Any shapes that have lots of points or turns, this would not really work too well. The way this particular method works is you take the SF101 or the interfacing, and on the non-fusible side, you draw the shape you would like. You then take that shape and you layer it with the fusible side, right side together with the fabric. So this is right side fabric up and the fusible side to that right side of the fabric. And I stitch then around that shape that I have drawn. Once that's done, I'm going to cut away the excess fabric beyond the stitching line, just as you see here. I've taken some pinking shears and I have left a 1/4 inch seam allowance around that stitching line. And I've also cut a little opening in the middle of the interfacing. And so what I do now is start to turn this shape out through that opening. And again, you can see why this works really well for simple shapes, because I've got to turn it out now and smooth out all those edges to this shape and make sure that it's all turned under. And then as I manipulate this shape, turning it out, I'll get something that looks like this. And it looks beautiful because the edge is turned under. And what I'm left with on the back is actually the fusible side of the fusible interfacing. So now I can simply take this shape that has a turned edge to it and iron it directly down onto my background fabric, as you see here. Then once again, taking that clear thread, and again, I like the Superior Thread monopoly version, and a very tiny blind hem stitch, you go and stitch around all these shapes. This does a great job of emulating hand needle turn applique, but again, it is only good for using simpler shapes like squares and circles, and maybe something like this teacup, because you're having to manipulate and turn out the shape there from the fusible interfacing. The third and final method I'd like to show you is probably the most successful method at emulating needle turn hand applique. You use a product called Ricky Tim's Stable Stuff, or you can use something called wash away applique paper. But Ricky Tim's Stable Stuff and wash away applique paper are simply paper that you can draw your shape on to set up a template, or for what's great about this also is that you can send it through your inkjet printer and actually print out the shape that you have here. You would then cut the shape out on the line, and I'll show you an example of that. And once you cut your shape out, you then paste it or glue it to the wrong side of the fabric you wish it to be. Now what I've done here is taken and cut away the excess fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then what I'm going to do is simply start to manipulate this fabric by using a glue stick and turning that edge over. So the prep work for this particular method is exactly the same as it would be for if you were doing it by hand and doing a turned edge. But instead of having to remove this paper, which is the usual course of action, I can leave that paper in because guess what? It is water soluble. So once I glue or pin my shape to my background fabric, and again you can see it on the teacup and saucer here, and then go around stitching around this shape with that clear thread again, that mono poly I like to use, and a very tiny blind hem stitch. Once I soak this block when it's done in some water, like a sink will do, or a bathtub if they're bigger blocks, the stable stuff, the paper that is left behind these applique shapes, actually dissolves away and becomes almost fibrous and creates a little bit of a trapunto effect. It fills in but becomes very soft and supple, and you really can't tell that anything is left in there. Again, it does a wonderful job of emulating needle turn hand applique, but without having to do the hand stitching that sometimes drives us crazy. You do the stitching by machine with the clear thread, and then once you soak this block, let it dry out, that edge turns under ever so slightly again when the block is drying and the fabric is drying out, and it looks exactly like needle turn hand applique. So I'm going to start here by working on stitching down the edges of this leaf first. I do have my Bernina set up on its blind hem stitch, which is stitch number 3 on my Bernina, and you can see that I have it relatively set at a rather small width and length. So I've got it about 1.2 width, which means that it'll take just a tiny little bite out of the edge of the applique, and about 0.65 or 0.50, somewhere in between there, for the length. So it's fairly close together. I've got my Bernina now threaded with the monofilament thread here and just a neutral white thread in the bobbin. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually drop my needle down right here at the edge and bring that bobbin thread up so that I don't get any nasty thread nest underneath, and that I can have a clean start with this. Now you're going to see some puncture holes into the fabric here because of course the magic happens once you soak this block. Those holes will actually shrink away. So I've got my needle, I've got probably a 70 size needle on the Bernina right now, and I'm just going to go ahead and start forward. Again, the blind hem stitch is going to take a couple stitches in the margin there or off to the edge of the applique, and then it goes in, as you can see, and takes a bite right there out of the edge of the applique. So the idea here is to just keep steady onto the edge of that applique shape and only allow it when it goes over to the left, if you will, to take that tiny little bite out of the edge of the applique. That's what's going to adhere your applique shape to your background fabric. And again, you're going to see some holes here with the monofilament thread because the magic happens again once the block is soaked overnight in water and then dries out, and all those holes magically disappear as the fabric shrinks in and the background fabric shrinks in with it. So you just keep to the edge of the applique, go slow and steady here. The same applique rules apply. When you're on an outside curve, you stop and pivot on the outside. And when you're on an inside curve, you stop and pivot on the inside. I do have my tension relatively low, and I adjusted that for the monofilament thread. So before I started, I made sure that I adjusted my tension to a lower number. It's at about 2 right now, so that the bobbin thread actually takes over and pulls this monofilament thread to the bottom for less, you don't want to see your bobbin thread on top. And you can also see how relatively fast I'm going stitching this applique shape down by machine versus doing a needle turn hand applique stitch. So again, the wonder of this method is once you have all your shapes set, ready to go, you just place them down on your background fabric, gluing them into place or pinning, and away you go stitching. So I hope you enjoyed those 3 methods that you can use at home and practice with to emulate hand needle turn applique, but doing it by machine. With that, I wish you happy coloricious quilting, and I'll see you out on the quilt road soon.